a lot of people have the idea that I want this horrible withdrawal pain to stop and I just want to get to zero. So my question is, why is it necessary to taper slowly?
Because it's the fastest way. I get the idea. If the goal is to reach zero, well, you could reach zero today, you could just stop. So if your goal is to reach zero, easily done. But if you want to reach 0 milligrams without going into severe withdrawal, tapering slowly is the way to go. And I bet you that if you just stopped or even tapered pretty fast, then the symptoms you would experience from getting to 0 to drastic dose reduction would be longer and more helpful for you to go through than a correct taper. So in the end, if your goal is to come off the drug, we kind of have to work on, obviously that is the goal, but we have to mentally change the goal to it being reaching 0 without getting into severe withdrawal and symptoms, and a question of integrating the symptoms, reducing and stabilizing into your daily routine for it not to completely pause your life, which may happen if you taper too fast. So the obvious answer to that question is that going slow is the fastest way. Symptoms from a too rapid taper, or just a cold turkey discontinuation, can last months or even years. Like that'll take longer for you with symptoms than it would if you tapered correctly. Now, tapering correctly doesn't mean that there will be no withdrawal symptoms, as we've talked about, because that would take, for some people definitely, we can taper the drug in a way with no or absolute minimum withdrawal symptoms. But for most people, there is still an element of managing it, because the body can detect so small dose reductions, especially towards the end, that for most people there's no way around withdrawal. And that's an important message. We don't want this to sound like all people can, with just a correct hyperbolic tapering, you can avoid withdrawal. No, you can make it manageable, and that is definitely possible. And then the next question, the next part of coming off the drugs is then how to manage being in those symptoms that may feel like something is terribly wrong, like your emotional, cognitive, physiological state. May be that something is wrong, only there isn't. It just feels like that. And we need to be, in some sense, cleverer than our body to detach from that and kind of leave that feeling alone and learn how to navigate it through. That, to me, is a much more, it's a better way off the drug than reaching 0 as fast as possible as the goal. So as you can see from this example, there is not what we would call a linear relationship between dose and occupancy. And just to clarify, dose is what we'd normally measure the drug in. But basically, dose is the drug's weight. It's the weight of the drug, 10, 20, 40 milligrams. That's not as important as what that amount of drug does in your brain. Like, these are different things. Think of dose just as a weight, but that weight says nothing about to what degree the drug occupies its receptors in the brain. So this is called, with a fancy word, receptor occupancy. And receptors are the structures in your brain and your whole nervous system that the drug is created, it's manufactured to enter the bloodstream and seek out certain receptors. And that is then called that they're occupied. So the drug occupies a receptor. And as we can see on the graph, there's no linear relationship between dose and occupancy. And that means even though the number 20 is the double of the number 10, as we can see on the graph, 10 gives rise to way more receptor occupancy. Like, the difference between 0 and 10 is bigger than the difference between 10 and 20, even though both are increments of 10. So, and that's what we call this, the shape of this curve is called hyperbolic. So that's what we mean with hyperbolic tapering. So it means that you can't just keep adding drug to your body expecting it to have an effect. There's kind of a saturation point over which it makes very little sense to add more drug is one thing. That's obviously, these graphs are the mean, it's the average. So you can't just enter. We've made them based on a lot of data from a lot of people. So you can't just enter the graph and say, okay, I'm on this many milligrams of that drug, my occupancy is this. There'll be variation around it. But for coming off the psychiatric drugs, where this gets relevant is that when you lower the dose, you go to the left on the graph, right? You move to a lower and lower dose. And as we talked about, tapering is all about allowing the body to readjust slowly and gradually to a lower dose. But in fact, dose in milligram is not the correct indicator of how much you can reduce the dose. The y-axis, the occupancy is. And that's where we get this very characteristic hyperbolic tapering shape, meaning that this, the classic story, depending on your dose, obviously, that it's good in the beginning, like this is going good, I get no withdrawals, or mild to moderate withdrawals. And you've maybe heard about how tough psychiatric drugs are to come off for most. You've heard the horror stories, and your symptoms at this point tend to be milder or moderate. So maybe I'm not one of those who get severe withdrawal then, because I can reduce without getting into severe withdrawal. And then at some point you make a reduction that in terms of milligram may not be bigger than the previous ones, but suddenly it is way harder. And that's where that's the experience, that's the bodily, emotional, psychological experience of going down that plateau on the graph you see. So this reduction was actually way bigger than the previous ones. And that's what we kind of want to capture. That's the whole idea of a hyperbolic tapering. In essence, all we want to do is follow that curve all the way down. Problem is, we don't know exactly when the curve will bend. We have ideas from research, from these brain studies and from experience, but we'll never know exactly when we'll make too big a reduction. Which is why it must be done slowly, and which is why we shouldn't experiment too much with it, because if you make the leap over and down below this bend on the curve, like you'll potentially have severe symptoms, and that'll end up taking way longer than it would if we did it carefully and slowly in the beginning.